Hi, everybody. I am a PhD student at MIT working on neuroscience and statistics. And today I'll be talking a little bit about my thesis work in neuroscience and statistics. And specifically, I'll be talking about hierarchical models for neural data analysis, which is my thesis topic. And first, I'll start by talking a little bit about myself, giving an overview of the talk, going through the presentation, and then we'll have a question and answers. So about myself, you already know my name. I did my undergrad at the University of Puerto Rico in biology, and I grew up in Puerto Rico. After spending time as an undergrad in Puerto Rico, I worked as a research scholar at the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences before starting grad school. So the figure that you're seeing here with some yellow tape is called a drive. It's a micro drive that is used to record neural activity from neurons from the rodent brains. So this is like about this size, and it's very light. And neuroscientists build it with their own hands, and they also use 3D printing. And so they then do experiments to record neural activity from rats. And on the right, you're looking at some histology that I did when I was a research scholar. So it's a slice of a brain of a rodent. And on my free time, I like to paint. So that's a little picture that I painted. Nowadays, I make pretty plots because I don't have that much time to paint. And now I'm a PhD student at MIT. And today I'll be talking about, giving you a really brief introduction to the kinds of data that are collected in systems neuroscience experiments. I'll be talking about how the data that are collected have this hierarchical structure. And I'll be giving you a brief overview of the kinds of models that we use for combining information across data sets and going through some case studies and some concluding remarks. So disclaimer, every single slide in this talk could probably be discussed as like a class during that semester. So it's going to be a lot of information compressed into small bits to give you a taste of the kind of research that we do in computational neuroscience. So in order to understand the brain, we need to collect data across multiple scales. The kinds of experiments that for which I analyze data are systems neuroscience experiments. And so they seek to understand how different parts of the brain are involved in regulating different kinds of brain functions. So you can think of how different parts of the brain interact to consolidate memories, or how different parts of the brain interact so that we can have good sleep or have conscious activity. And in the right, you can see a schematic diagram that I took from a paper. I should look for the reference and credit it. This is from some paper. Sorry, the reference is not here. But the idea is that you have these recordings from the brain using tetrodes, and you can measure how the voltage changes over time. And if you split that into signal of high frequency activity and low frequency activity, then the low frequency activity gives you what's called local field potential. And then the high frequency activity is later used for thresholding and detecting what are called spike trains. And the spike trains give us a binary time series that occurs continuously in time. It's these spikes rasters here that you see that are like a very, very sharp impulse functions. And those sequences give us an idea of how different neurons are communicating to mediate some kind of behavior. So the data are very, very complex because this is typically collected at 1000 hertz, which is a very high sampling rate. And we have to collect these data from hundreds to thousands of neurons over sometimes seconds to minutes to hours across multiple sessions and subjects. So you can start to see that there's this hierarchical structure in the data. And we can use the theory of point processes to analyze these spike trains. The point process is a stochastic process, which means that it's random, of a series of integers that occur continuously in time. So for every time point, you have a number that is either 1, 2, 3, or 4 associated to it. In case of our spike trains, you can think of them as coin flips. You either have a 1 or a 0, 1 or a 0. And so we can characterize these spike trains using a conditional intensity function, which gives us the probability of observing a spike in a small time window. To build a statistical model, we can use conditional independence given HT, which is the history, to model the spike trace series as a Bernoulli process. And this has some convenient mathematical properties. We can use generalized linear models. If you work with logistic regression models, then this formula here will look familiar to you. And we can use a principal statistical framework to assess the extent to which the model captures the structure in the data, which is called the time rescaling theorem. There are 2 papers that I'm citing here. There are more references below if you're interested in learning more about these things. And there's another important model that we can use to link these observations over time. So we want to characterize the point process structure. We want to characterize the time series structure. And to characterize the time series structure, we can use state space models, which let us link observations over time by having a discrete or continuous latent state. So here, the circles denote a hidden state we don't observe, but we estimate from data. And in the continuous case, we can estimate it via adaptive filtering or expectation maximization. In the discrete case, we end up with a forward-backward algorithm and Viterbi decoding used in hidden Markov models or hidden state Markov models. So what is the hierarchical structure and how do we use it? Well, Fitzmaurice wrote a really nice book about hierarchical data called Applied Longitudinal Data Analysis. And he says that multi-level data arise when there's a hierarchical or cluster structure in the data. That means that within a particular cluster, data are more similar to each other or varying. So in our case, if we look at an example data set, here we have a stimulus, and these are recordings from a part of the brain called the thalamus. We have neuron 1 and neuron 2. And here we can see that there are 3,000 seconds of data. And sorry, not 3,000 milliseconds. This is milliseconds, so 3 seconds. Each dot denotes that there was a spike. So if we have a dot, we have a spike. And if we don't have a dot, we don't have a spike. And we have data collected across multiple trials. And each of these plots is data from one animal. So we have, at a first level, we have a spike train collected over many time points. Then we have neuron. Then we have brain region, trials, sessions, subjects, and a stimulus. So we can, for this particular data set, we have this stimulus, but she also did the experiments under 3 different kinds of stimulus. So we could also ask the question, okay, how does this response vary as a function of stimulus? So we can take into account the variability between data across multiple animals by using a hierarchical model. We can see here that even though visually it seems like there's a really high response as a function of this stimulus going up and down, there's a little bit of uncertainty. For example, we see outside of the stimulus, here there's a lot of activity going on. And here we see that there's kind of like a noisier data set. So it's important to take into account this variability, and we can do that using a hierarchical model. So the basic hierarchical models have been broadly used in the field of statistics, in applied statistics. And one case study that I really like is from a paper by Bois and Gelman. They were doing some pharmacokinetic analysis, and they have this model in the triangle here, and they have some data. And in their case, they have a mathematical model, they have a nonlinear model, and they have data from multiple subjects. So they want to do alternative quantification at a level of the population of individuals because it's a toxicokinetic application, so it's important to characterize it at a level of population, but they also want to do it at a level of each individual. So what they do is that for this model is a function of x, which is covariate, measured data, and theta, which is unknown. And the theta and the data link it to the observations. And the parameters, we can give them a shared prior distribution. Here I've written a generic prior distribution, but you can think about it, for example, a Gaussian distribution. This hyperparameter here could be the mean, and this hyperparameter here could be the variance. That would be one simple example. We can have the hyperparameters be constants that we estimate from the data, and we can also have them be random variables, and then we have hyperparameters. So you can see how we can start to build a more complex hierarchical model depending on our needs for doing some analysis. So now I'll be talking about some case studies where I've started to build on the hierarchical modeling framework. The first case study is a really simple study. We have blood oxygenation levels during anesthesia, and we built a state-space model to characterizing this data. So not point processes, but actually a physiological response that was measured during the anesthetic state. And this data were published in a paper by Bastos and my advisor. It's called Neural Effects of Propofol-Induced Unconsciousness, and it's reversal using thalamic stimulation. And the problem here is that we wanted to assess the extent to which the anesthetic drug altered the physiological responses like blood oxygenation, but we had data sets that were very noisy. So for example, here you see examples from 4 different animals, and the black dots indicate the blood oxygenation level. And these are measured over several minutes. So you can see it's a long recording session. And it's a percentage of blood oxygenation. And the red circles indicate instances in which we have a dropout of the measurement. So we have missing data. And that in itself is a problem because we no longer have evenly sampled data points. So it's hard to use a typical statistical modeling framework like a state-space model for each of them. So what we did here is that we used a state-space model. And the state equation is a hidden state that links the observation over time. We estimate it from data. And we have J subjects. Now the state equation is shared across all of the subjects. And we have an observation model for each individual subject that is a function of the unobserved state and some noise process. The noise process is specific to that particular subject. What we do is we combine information across the sessions by having them share the latent state. And this lets us estimate the black trees here with the gray 95% confidence intervals, which is the population level estimate of the blood oxygenation level. And we can see that there's a drop. After the drug infusion, it drops and then it increases again. And a nice thing about this framework is that we can do uncertainty quantification at a population level, even though we had these missing observations across the different sessions. And we can also use a Monte Carlo approach for doing uncertainty quantification. That is, once we estimate the posterior means and variances of these parameters, we can use simulation to get a random z of t and a random estimate of the y of t. And we can ask, okay, what is the probability that the blood oxygenation decreases in time t relative to time t minus 1? And we can ask that at an arbitrary confidence level. So here, the red means that the probability that the blood oxygenation is decreasing is greater than 0.95. And so that's a way to get do uncertainty quantification, and we can assess statistical significance all in one go. And if you're curious to learn more about the research, you can read this paper. It's publicly available. It was published in eLife, so everybody should have access to it. Okay. Second case study is characterizing the response of multiple spectres to a whisker stimulus. So this is more neural data, and it's more relevant to what I talked about before. And here, this is unpublished work. I presented a poster on this on SFN last year, but it's still unpublished work. So here I introduced a multi-level structure for a general experiment. We have n subjects, and for each subject, we have different number of sessions, trials, neurons, data samples, and time steps, which are taken to be of 1 millisecond. And so we have an index set, which is the union of all of these other sets. So C indexes one unique element of all of these sets. And I introduced a notation delta NKC, which gives me a 1 if there's a spike from neuron C at type TK and 0 otherwise. And for covariates, I use the spike history because that allows me to combine the statistical dependencies of the time series observations occurring over time. And we have, similarly, we have stimulus, which can also have its own history. And the goal of this framework is to combine the point process framework that I mentioned before with the hierarchical modeling framework. There are a lot of equations here, but basically the gist of it is that we can model each individual spike stream as a Bernoulli process. So similar as what I talked about before, we can use a state space model to link observations continuously over time, and we can combine data from different sessions by having these model parameters be drawn from shared prior distributions. And we can do the expectation maximization to estimate the model parameters. So this is the data that I showed you before. I've combined it into a single raster plot. So if you put the data from all of the animals into one big raster plot, you end up with something that looks like this. And above is still the same as before. And now we have some idea of what the population level and individual level spike rate functions look like. So the spiking probability, since we have Bernoulli processes, it's either something between 0 and 1. We can see that the spiking probability is very close to 0 outside of the stimulus and above 0.5 within types of the stimulus. So there's a very strong modulation of the stimulus to predict the response. The advantage of this framework is that we also get the MAP estimates of the parameters, and we can check the extent to which the model assumptions check. So we can look at the histograms of the model parameters, and we can plot that alongside with the population level parameter distributions. And we can also get a goodness of fit estimate. So these are called KS plots, Kolmogorov-Smirnov plots. And basically, if the model is doing a good job, the pink line should be along the diagonal. And we can see that there's some lack of fit. This could be due to unaccounted history. It could be due to the parameters being too sharp around the mean, for example. So that's something that can be rechecked once you've already fit the model. Yeah. And the second case study is characterizing up and down states during slow wave sleep in the rodent cortex. I imagine, I don't know how many neuroscientists are here, or if there are any, but basically the brain during sleep exhibits very strong rhythmic activity. And so neuroscientists talk about that in terms of up and down states. So here, as before, we have a similar multi-level structure. We have several subjects, sessions, and neurons and time samples. And similar, we have data NK, JMN being one if we have a spikers here otherwise. But now I'm using a different history function to capture the dependence structure between the spiking over time. And the reason for that is so that we can have a low dimensional representation of a high dimensional data set. And that allows us to get a good estimate of the model without needing so many parameters. So this function models the contribution of history as an exponentially decaying function. And the idea here is that instead of having a continuous latent state, now we're going to have a discrete latent state. It's going to be either 0 or 1, down or up. We can still use the Bernoulli process to model the likelihood function of the observations, but now we're going to incorporate that with a hidden semi-Markov model framework. And now we can, with the hidden semi-Markov model framework, the latent state is a semi-Markov process. It has some state duration. When you're in one state, you will remain in that state for a certain amount of time and transition out of it with certain probability. And we can model that explicitly. This is the framework that I'm using. We can use whatever parametric distribution we want to use. We can also use a non-parametric approach. Here I went with a parametric approach because it can be tied back into the scientific literature. So there are many technical details to all of this. We can aggregate states to use an augmented state representation. You can look at the work of Landgraf and Zucchini to get a better idea of these details. And the idea is that you have these blocked transition probability matrices that capture the time that you will stay in a particular state. Okay, so these are the results, and these are also the data. Each of these subplots shows data from one animal. These are rodents that were asleep, and they had drives implanted similar to the ones that I showed you in the first picture. And the vertical lines show the rasters, and the shaded lines show the estimated state. The shaded pink shows upstate, and in the absence of it, we have a downstate. And we can also see that for an individual raster. So for an individual spike train, we can see that there is a fairly good agreement between the estimated state and what we see visually as looking like down or up. We can do uncertainty quantification at a neuron level, which is shown in this subplot, check the fit, and also do uncertainty quantification at the population level. So these are group level KS plots. And we can see that the model is doing a fairly good job at characterizing the structure in all of the data. A second advantage is that we can also get uncertainty quantification on the state duration and on the rate. So for example, since I use, I assumed that the state durations had different distributions, we can look at the estimated posterior distributions of the state duration and also get confidence intervals through Monte Carlo. Okay, so the takeaway message is that hierarchical models are helpful for combining data that have a multi-level structure. The model allows for performing uncertainty quantification at every level of the data structure. We can do parameter estimation through different approaches like Markov-Chain Monte Carlo, expectation maximization, or others. Here I've used expectation maximization because we have very long data sets, and so it's more computationally tractable. There are many fields that have used these models, and it's very likely that in your own applications, you could use some hierarchical models. Some references that you can look at to read more about this are the Bois and Gelman paper where he developed population toxicokinetics of tetrachloroethylene, and my advisor's paper on the theory of point processes, higher papers on hidden Markov models, hidden semi-Markov models for characterizing cortical recordings, and several books that are also included here. And that's all that I have for you. I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Josefina. It's very, very interesting. I'm a biological engineer before I started working on data. So
nice.
I share that that spontaneously. I mean, that love for all the things that where you can apply to biology. And I'm also a biology enthusiast. There are a couple of chats sorry, I got nervous. I got a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'm going to read the first one for you. So one is, what are the advantages of using a state space instead of just apply a mixed effects model? Why regular mixed effects models are not suitable for these applications?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you can use a mixed effects model in terms of like regular mixed effects model. I know there are a lot of toolboxes available that you could use, but the data sets that we work with are so large that it's hard to use any off-the-shelf model. Like if you even try to build just a generalized linear model, you know, no levels, and try to use a built-in function in MATLAB, you will struggle to analyze all of the data in one session. So that's one reason why, you know, general off-the-shelf mixed effects models have not really been used that frequently for neural data analysis. And the state space model approach, there's another advantage to state space model, which is that you can do forecasting. So in neuroscience, it is often of interest to design experiments where you can forecast the neural signal and then build a controller that will do some kind of experimental manipulation. Like if you want to study how some particular part of the brain is involved in some kind of behavior, you might want to do an inhibition experiment. You want to inhibit that activity and see how that affects behavior. Or maybe you want to induce that activity, so you need to have a forecasting model. So it's very helpful to have some kind of state space representation for being able to do that. And then the other one is that it does a really good job at tracking the time series structure of the data. That is, you're estimating, getting a point estimate of the instantaneous probability of spiking. So when you're just building a generalized linear model, mixed effect or not, you're sort of constrained by a particular set of parameters. And the data that are recorded from the brain are very much non-stationary. So it's good to have some random component that lets you link those observations over time as they evolve dynamically. Does that answer your question?
It was Jaime Mosquera who asked the question. Jaime, does that answer your question? Thanks, Jaime. He said yes. He also made a different question. Is this framework a general one which includes another simpler models as particular cases?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So definitely, in the hidden semi-Markov model framework, if you take out the hidden state, you just end up with a random effects GLM. So that's a special case. If you just take out the random effects, you just end up with a GLM. So they're all sort of linked together.
Perfect. Is there anyone else having questions? Although Josefina made an excellent job explaining all the details of the techniques, and you brought such different cases that I think that they answered everything. Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat, but thank you so much, Josefina. I think that everything was super clear. Again, it was an honor to hear about your thesis. Oh, okay. There's one new question. If someone were to learn from a very, very entry level, what are about hierarchical models and their applications? What are some materials or resources that they can access to from a very, very entry level?
Okay, so if you're like starting like an absolute beginner, I would say learn linear algebra super, super well. Like that's the fundamental applied math research that you need to understand very well before diving into the modeling aspect, because these are very complex models and have very complex data sets. So it's really useful to have the ability to represent them in terms of vector matrix products in your head and pen and paper. And then I would take a look at Gelman's book, Andrew Gelman, Data Analysis Using Regression and Multi-Level Models. You should have some statistics and basic probability background before doing that. There are some places where you can get that. For example, via MIT OpenCourseWare, you can do a MicroMasters on data science. And you can take a lot of the courses that are actually the ones that I've taken at MIT through OpenCourseWare. And these courses include basic probability and statistics, and you do some capstone project. So once you've done that, I would say that you're good to go in terms of learning about these more complex models. And in terms of learning about the models, I would say find a project where you can play around with them, because that way you can really test your understanding. You really are able to learn how much you know about a topic when you are able to work on a project and apply that knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. Also, a quick question here. Is the MIT Open Courses available through the MIT webpage, or is there a specific webpage where people should go to check that?
I would Google MIT MicroMasters. Let me Google that because I don't remember that off the top of my head, but I know that there's MIT OpenCourseWare also, so I will look that up. It might be through edX.
I wrote it down on the chat in case anyone wants to Google it afterwards.
MITx Data Science Program, MicroMasters. It's through edX.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And it's like
I
this?
will. Let me see if I can type the link on the chat.
Okay. And when you do, please check that on the two, you have the option of everyone. It should say everyone instead of host and panelists. There's another question, but I'll let you put the link first.
Oh, not Josefina, it's everybody. Okay.
I have 2 more questions. If you want, I can just look for the link and I will send it to the audience whenever we post the YouTube video and or in the Wooba app. But there are 2 questions that Jose, if you have.
Oh yeah, okay. Sorry, I found it. This should be the link.
Perfect. Okay, so people is getting curious. We have 3 more questions. So the first one is, what programming language environment do you usually use to develop these applications?
Julia. I use Julia. I really like Julia because you can be very explicit about the kinds of data structures that you use, and that allows you to control the amount of memory that you use for running specific computations, and also for really harnessing the power of your computer. Like if you have a GPU or CPU, then you can use specific data arrays for using them properly. And I like that it's all open source. Yeah. So I like that open source culture, and I like that the people who are developing are kind of hardcore applied mathematicians. So they figure out really clever ways of creating fast code using applied math. I think everybody should use Julia.
We'll need to check Julia. There is another question. Andres Becerra asks, aren't deep learning models, given its nature of learning representation, a kind of hierarchical model? In this case, using CNN over spectrograms of the signal simulations?
Yeah, I think deep neural network models are also kind of a hierarchical model. There's also Bayesian networks. I think all of it's connected. This is more based on the statistical modeling framework, which has like different historical foundations and different ways of thinking about the approaches. But I think that it's all connected. I'm just not super well versed with deep neural network models, but I'm also interested in learning more about them.
Yeah, that sounds fair. Other person asked, Hellman book is Hellman book is written in R, and if there is more material or packages about this topic in R than in Python. I guess the question if for this application, which of the two is more popular? Is that R or is Python?
Yeah, it depends on the user, I think. Like biostatisticians tend to use R more. Mathematicians seem to also use R more. Gelman, originally the book was mainly developed in R, so there are a lot of packages in R for fitting hierarchical models. They also developed their own probabilistic programming language called STAN. So it's a probabilistic programming language in that you declare objects as random variables and you specify which distributions they belong to. And it does a lot of the inference in the back of the envelope. Like you don't really see all of that. And it uses a fully Bayesian framework. But you can use STAN within Julia, R, or Python, or maybe C. So it's kind of independent of programming language. I'm actually not that familiar with the tools that are available in Python because I'm mainly a Julia user nowadays. But I think that going along from the lines of what the previous person said, that there are a lot of deep learning toolboxes that can also be considered hierarchical models in Python. So it just depends on your application.
So it just depends on the person that is going to do it.
Yeah.
Like
in my case, in my case, the toolboxes don't really work for me because I have such large data sets, so I have to build everything from scratch. So I build my own toolboxes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So thank you so much, Josefina. This was very interesting. I really feel honored having you here on the Learning Fest. Thank you for being here celebrating knowledge with us, and thank you everyone who attended this talk. And yeah, we'll post this video on YouTube. Thank you so much. See you later.
Thank you for having me.